Call the meeting to order, please. We have a presentation this morning at the request of the ranking minority member. She wanted to hear about some urban water issues, and we have asked Dr. Tim Kane to come in and speak to us. Is it Kane or Keen? Who's going to speak? Is there online? Okay. Dr. Kane, Kent State University, is going to give us a presentation. Is he there? Yes.
Can you hear us, Dr. King?
Shows he's online.
You there, Dr. King?
Hey, Damien, we don't think he can hear us, so we're going to call him because the chat isn't on.
I've not been able to hear any of what's happened so far.
Oh,
And I'm unmuted. What I've done on Zoom, Meredith, before when this has happened is I just get off totally and then get back on and see if that works. I'll give that a try. If that doesn't work, we'll maybe do it over the phone. So you can just, if that doesn't work, just call me back and I'll put speakerphone on and we can do it that way. Okay? Yep.
His fault. It's too late now. Yes, we do.
Can you hear us, Dr. King?
Now can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
can you hear us, Dr. Keen?
We can see him, we can hear him, but he can't hear us.
Victoria, can you give him a call?
Yeah, we'll call him back.
Meredith, can you hear me? You can hear me, okay. Okay. No, no, so it's gonna be hard to question. You wanna do this over the phone? Okay, but everybody in the room can hear me. Okay, this is gonna be good. This is like a silent audience. Okay, okay, thanks. Okay, so I guess everyone can hear me, but I can't hear you, so I guess I've got a silent audience. Good morning, and sorry about the technical glitches, but such is the world of virtual meetings. My name, if you don't know me, is I'm Dr. Tim Kane. I'm a professor of landscape architecture at Kansas State University. Been teaching here since 1984. And for the last 20 some years have specialized in research and in teaching, both in terms of river science, fluvial geomorphology, and connected urban water storm systems. So I'm going to share screen and hope we don't get blown out here. Can you all see that? Great. Give me a high sign if you can see that. Okay, I've got a brief presentation prepared, which I think you all have access to or can see. And in this presentation, I'll be using a few terms or concepts that you've probably heard before, but which get used in different ways or defined differently in different contexts. So I'm going to start out with looking at defining those terms and concepts the way I use them. And I think of those as the pieces of the fluvial, which means flowing water or river system. Then I'm going to define some of those relationships between those pieces or components of that system, and then talk briefly about how those systems react to change. Now, the first term I want to look at is watershed, and people define this differently. For about 4 or 5 years, I taught a 4-H Discovery Days course for kids that came in the summer to K-State, and I taught a short course on rivers. And I always asked them what a watershed was, and I got a ton of different responses. But basically, a watershed, as I define it, is an area of the Earth's surface that contributes water, sediments, and dissolved materials to a common outlet, a specific river or river network system. The watershed is defined, it's delineated, if you will, by boundaries. Those boundaries are ridge tops. And the boundaries or drainage divides separate one watershed from another. The continental divide is a drainage divide essentially between the Mississippi system and the Colorado and Columbian system. Here's an illustration of on the landscape of watersheds and drainage divides on the ridges, as you can see, and then the stream network within each one of those watersheds. And we can define the size of a watershed by where we pick out the outlet. So we could have a large watershed, or I could pick out the outlet, if you can see my cursor here, and then this would be a smaller watershed. So there is no set size for a watershed. But the thing I would ask you to think about is that watersheds, every part of the Earth's surface is a watershed. It is within a watershed. And watershed boundaries are natural boundaries as opposed to the way we often look at managing water, particularly urban stormwater, and we use political boundaries. But these are natural boundaries of topography. And here's an example. I don't know how well you can see it on your screen, but this is Kings Creek on Konza Prairie. The dark blue is the stream network within that watershed, and the light blue is the drainage divide delineating that watershed. So by simply selecting the place where Kings Creek goes into McDowell Creek, we can delineate that watershed based on that. And I think this is about 12 square miles or something to that effect. Another term which I'll use just a second is discharge. And this is maybe a more technical term, but discharge, as it's defined in fluvial geomorphology or in hydrology, is a volume of water passing a given point in a given time interval. Typically in the US, we still measure this, as measured by the USGS, the US Geological Survey, in cubic feet per second. Other countries are moving to cubic meters per second, or have been there. And as you can see there, it's the cross-sectional area times the velocity of the water. Stream hydrograph, and I'm going to be talking about these and how urbanization affects the stream hydrograph. But a stream hydrograph is simply a plotting of discharge on the vertical axis over time on the horizontal axis. So that volume of water passing a given point in a given interval of time is on the vertical axis, and time is on the horizontal. The other thing I want to point out, and I hope you can see my cursor, is these bars are what's referred to as a hyetograph. And these are plotting essentially a rainfall event. And at the center of the rainstorm, the mass center of the rainstorm, the distance or the length of time between that mass center of the rainstorm and the peak discharge, peak flow rate, is referred to as the centroid lag time, or just more simply the lag time. And that varies in different situations. If we get a short, heavy downpour, then that hydrograph is going to be shaped more like this. If we have a steady light rain, that hydrograph in terms of the flow is going to be shaped more like that. And it varies from wet to dry watersheds. And it can vary within the same watershed depending on how much rain you've had or how much soil moisture there is to begin with. Here's what we can see as the effect on the hydrograph when we have urbanization. You can see here the hyetograph, the rainfall event or precipitation event, has been put on the bottom rather than on the top. And you can see here's pre-urban conditions on the red or purple colored line. And here's after urbanization. This bottom line is stream base flow. I'll come back to that in just a minute. But what happens when we urbanize is we take the same amount of rainfall and convert more of it to runoff, less of it to infiltration going into the soil. As we do that to a large enough area, we're converting a huge portion of that rainfall event into stream flow. We also get it to the stream much more quickly because we want to put it in storm sewers or run it off as quickly as we can. So what it causes is higher flood peaks. We flood more quickly, and we flood more frequently after urbanization. Here's the pre-urban stream flow. So before it was urbanized, you can see that more infiltration occurs. And so it takes longer to get to that peak. That peak is much lower, and it comes down. Now, what most of these diagrams don't show is the effect on this base flow. This one doesn't show it either, but when we convert, say, 80% of that rainfall event to runoff, and it goes into this flood flow or urban stream flow, there's less going into the ground to support that stream during periods where it's not raining. The urban streams not only get flashy in that they flood at a higher level, they flood quicker, and they flood more frequently, they tend to be dry for longer periods of the non-raining season. And if you're interested in any kind of habitat for aquatic organisms or macroinvertebrates or fish, you lose it when you lose that base flow that's fed by that groundwater that comes from infiltration. So factors that affect that change in lag time: impermeable surfaces, concrete, buildings, roads, compacted soils. Even if we have large areas such as parks that are left open and green space, we still compact the soils and reduce the infiltration capacity. And when we've got sod or turf growing on those soils with root systems that are only about 4 or 5 inches deep, they don't do near what the native grasses do to put the roots down and open those soils up for increased infiltration over time. So the vegetation matters, the topography matters. We often change the grades when we develop in urban areas. And then also the basic soil types. Our soils in the Flint Hills area and in the eastern Kansas tend to be high in clay, so they don't have the highest infiltration capacities in the first place. Rural areas, we see some of the impacts or some of the controls of runoff. Urban areas, we see some of the problems created by that increase of impermeable surface and the decrease in infiltration capacity. So we see the increased storm runoff that we have to try and manage, and we have difficulties managing that. We have for a very long time. We see stream channel instability. So any receiving stream of these new stormwater runoff infrastructure or facilities is going to lose its stability because we're changing the inputs of both water and sediment. We see a decrease in water quality from the standpoint of running in increased amounts of sediment, at times increased nutrients from lawn fertilization, increased in terms of bacteria from pet waste and other types of waste. And I could go on and on with the problems that are created when we decrease that infiltration and increase that runoff in urban areas. Here's one I use with my students, and don't worry, I'm not going to give you a quiz on having you do the equations, but it just compares various types of land cover from the standpoint of a coefficient of runoff, which is used in a very simple runoff prediction equation. And you can see in forest, we get 10 to 20% is what those numbers indicate a runoff, and that means 80 to 90% of it is going into the soil and supporting stream flow, recharging groundwater during periods where it's not raining. Cultivated, we reduce that infiltration because of compaction, because of lack of cover on the soil, creation of plow pans if we till too frequently. Residential, 40 to 50% is running off. And I know that's an interest of the committee and how we deal with those residential scale aspects. And we get to urban, we can have 90 to almost 100% runoff if we go to huge amounts of impermeable surface. As I mentioned earlier, we also move the water to the stream channels more quickly, the receiving channels more quickly. because it's a lot quicker for water to run over a concrete or asphalt surface than it is to go into the ground and move slowly down gradient towards the stream channel. Various models have been around for quite some time. This one was introduced by Schuler in the late 80s, looking at how much total impermeable surface does it take before we start to degrade the systems or cause the streams to become nothing more than storm sewers. So Schuler believed that 10 to 25% impermeable surface or impervious cover, we started to see problems develop. Once we went past 25% in Schuler's model, they would no longer support their designated uses, such as habitat provision. They don't become very good at handling flood flow because they tend to insize and lose contact with their floodplain. And once we go past 60% impervious cover, they basically just become a storm sewer. So back to the impacts illustrated in a slightly different hydrograph, urban and pre-urban conditions. We're decreasing that centroid lag time between the peak precipitation and the peak discharge. We've got more runoff more quickly, so we increase flood frequency, we increase pollution, we decrease groundwater for base flow and for groundwater recharge, and we increase channel erosion and instability. So one of the things that has been around for quite some time falls under the whole category of green infrastructure. And the whole purpose of green infrastructure is to try and move that hydrograph from this closer to this. So in other words, convert more of the rainfall events to infiltration and less to runoff. And there's all kinds of different names for green infrastructure treatments. Bioswales, rain gardens, some of these you've heard of, infiltration basins, permeable pavement, constructed wetlands, and the list goes on and on. But what we're trying to do through any of these is to make more of that rainfall event go into the soil where it can move much more slowly down gradient, reduce the flood peaks, reduce the pollution volumes, because the soil can filter out many of those things. And with gray infrastructure, we're treating stormwater as kind of a waste product that we want to remove from sites as quickly as possible. And in some ways, we're just sending our problems downstream. And with the coming predictions in terms of what's going to happen to our rainfall and what's going to happen to our drought periods, I think one of the things we need to do is start thinking about stormwater as a resource that we should be trying to store in the soil rather than as a waste product that we need to remove from a site as quickly as possible. So that's my last slide. I wanted to be brief. We had a little bit of a delay, and I would ask that Meredith, since I can't hear you, if you guys could go on a speakerphone, we'll do that question and answer if you have any questions, or if I have any answers via the phone. So Damien or Meredith, if you want to give me a call back, I'll set up on speakerphone and you can figure out how to ask questions from your end.
Questions, go ahead and speak to Victoria, and she will transfer the question on over to him. So, Representative Bishop.
I'm going to try to make this brief. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But I just want to relate that about 15 years ago, my husband and I had a major re-landscaping job done to our house, which is in a first layer suburban ring around Wichita. And our goal, we had two goals. One was to reduce the runoff from our yard. And the second goal was to keep the reduction or keep the runoff on our property to the maximum extent possible.
Okay.
And I don't know if Dr. King can hear me, but we hired a landscape architect and we used a series of swales. There's a giant swale that goes all the way around our house like a C that collects the runoff. And we use berms to slow down the runoff from that into and from that swale. We constructed a dry creek through our backyard with a bridge over it. It's absolutely lovely. It includes a French trench, which is a process of digging down about 5 to 8 feet. I can't remember exactly how many, filling it with rocks and basically encouraging the runoff to that point, which is only about 40 yards away from the stormwater drainage. The dry creek includes 2 bubblers. One bubbler comes from the back part of the rain gutters and downspouts on our house. And the other bubbler comes from the sump pump. And those are in the dry creek, so when the sump pump goes off, and it starts with a whistle, and you know to step back because it's going to be like a little fountain coming up. I just wanted to relate that because of what was happening before we did that is that the drainage from our neighbors' yards was threatening our foundation and our basement. And since we have created this, not only do I firmly believe we've reduced the runoff from our yard, but we've had no problems with basement leakage or pressure or that sort of thing. We seem to have totally resolved it, and I think in a way that makes us good neighbors and good citizens. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Did he wish to comment after that, Victoria?
Dr. King, can you hear us? Dr. King, I think you're muted.
I only heard part of that question, and I've got my phone turned up on volume as far as I can. And I hate to admit this, but I just turned the volume up on my hearing aids as well. So if I could have that repeated, maybe not the whole thing, but the part that I might be able to respond to.
Dr. King, I was talking about a drainage, a landscape project on my own home where we attempted to retain the runoff on our property to the greatest extent possible. And it did cost several $1,000s, I will admit, but it has resulted in a yard landscape that looks much more natural and is absolutely lovely. We did a lot of the work ourselves. We hauled rocks for about 3 weeks in the middle of July, never do that again, and created a dry creek through our backyard, a system of swales and berms to reduce runoff both coming to us and definitely the runoff leaving our yard. There's more that we would like to do, but it seems to be working well and has certainly stabilized some foundation problems and basement issues we were experiencing. Thank you.
Well, I've dealt with several issues like that before. We've even done subdivision plans that will, are you getting feedback from me? You're okay. Subdivision plans, it's tough to get those things approved at the subdivision level because people think if you do it on your yard, you're going to flood theirs. And we had trouble getting those things approved. It was a plan that we did for a subdivision to try and deal with issues just as you've been dealing with. So I think there needs to be incentive to do that. Some communities have tried things of lowering your water and sewer bill. If you count for taking care of runoff on your property, so disconnecting those gutters from the storm sewers, retaining water on your property in rain gardens or bioswales or dry creek beds, as you suggest. Most of those are at the municipal level. There are some county level planning policies, regulations, if you will. In Kansas, I haven't dealt with them for a while, but the most progressive stormwater management policy I saw at the county level comes from Johnson County. And they were even taking a certain tax or a certain percentage of water and sewer bills to devote to research to how to better handle stormwater. So years ago, I worked with Dr. Stacy Hutchinson in bioag engineering on a couple of projects over in Johnson County that were paid for based upon that 5% of the water bill and sewerage bill. So I guess one of the major policies I think could be looked at, or a perspective that could be looked at the state level, might be to encourage the management of stormwater on these more natural boundaries in terms of drainage divides. We did some research, it's probably been 7-8 years ago, on a National Science Foundation grant. We looked nationwide at watershed across urban areas across the nation. And we looked at watersheds that were called HUC 14s, which is Hydrologic Unit Code 14. Those watersheds averaged about 40 square miles in area. And what we found was that there are more jurisdictional boundaries within that watershed, or the more fragmentation that occurred, the lower the water quality from the standpoint or the measure of turbidity, which is a measure of sediment. So the more we could encourage management of water anyway on these natural boundaries rather than on political boundaries, I think it would serve us well, not only in handling excess stormwater management, but handling a lot of the pollutants which ride into the streams and storms on the sediment particles. Yeah, I see a thing in the chat from Representative Highland and about impermeable cover. Yes, 10 to 20% will affect natural flow of the stream channel.
Representative Stodsdill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing caught my eye as you were giving your presentation. I come from Johnson County, which is a rapidly expanding urban area, obviously. And you mentioned permeable concrete. What is that? What do you see the future for that?
Could you repeat that, sir?
Yeah, it's, I come from Johnson County, which is rapidly expanding and growing. And we're dealing with a lot of issues about runoff on our roads and concreted areas, parking lots, that sort of thing. And you mentioned permeable concrete. What is that? I've never heard of that. And what's the future of that, do you think?
Well, permeable pavement and permeable concrete, the jury's still out, at least from my standpoint. It's made so it allows water to go through the pores in the concrete. So you can think of it kind of akin to a gravel road, but over time, those pores fill up with, just detritus of the earth, with road salt and dirt and dust that blows in there. And the other thing with it is we usually have to compact the subgrade in order to support that concrete so it doesn't break all up. So it's a good idea in theory, but it's one of the things I don't think it's as efficient. It could help some, But I think more with developing areas, and lots of parking lots, I would look more at trying to deal with bioswales instead of parking islands, deal with bioswales. I know you can look at reducing the number of required parking stalls for square footage of development, depending on what kind of development it is. And then if it's a large enough development, can we look at what we used to call detention basin, where we would just trap excess runoff and let it off slowly? And we can still do those basins on site, but we need to make sure that they have a leaky bottom. So we're putting that water, as much of it as we can, into the soil rather than running it off after the peak of the storm event.
Great. Mr. Chair, I had one quick other question, if I could. Yeah, I live in Prairie Village, which is really kind of badly named because we live in literally an urban forest there. And you look at it on MapQuest, you can hardly see the houses for the trees and so on. What's the impact of trees and so on runoff and retention of water?
Well, I didn't get into all of this, but on a rainfall event, depending on the vegetation cover, a large portion of that precipitation, sometimes up to 50%, depending on the rainfall event, can be intercepted by the foliage. Now, some of that's going to drip off the foliage and enter the soil more slowly and more gently than it would if the soil were exposed. But some of that's just going to evaporate back to the atmosphere after it's done raining. So interception is a good thing, and forest cover is very good, but it's not the sole answer. We have to look at a whole range of solutions that, as I said before, shift that hydrograph to where we're putting more in infiltration and less in runoff. But tree cover, such as what you're describing, is very helpful.
Great. Thank you. It's a very interesting presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Dr. Kane, this was wonderful. Thank you for taking the time today. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Sorry. Not a stone's throw from this building is a very interesting rain garden. I don't know if anybody has noticed it. It starts at the corner of Jackson and 8th Street and goes north for about 5 blocks. It's something that the city has created to help deal with urban runoff, and it works beautifully. It looks like it's kind of filled with mulch right at the moment, probably trying to save the plants from the Arctic temperatures we had a while back. But it will be absolutely beautiful this spring. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And now we must move on.
Before I leave, if there's anything else that I can do, any questions come up afterwards, they've got my email, and I'll be happy to address it. So,
Thank you again, and we'll do just that. Thank you very much. Okay, now, as per the schedule, we're going to open it up for discussion on the information we've received this entire session. So let's have it. I'll start calling names if I don't hear anything. Rebsey Minix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll give everybody else an opportunity to come up with their question. I was going to ask Dr. Keene, but I believe a 30-acre shopping mall with roof and concrete in a 1.2-inch rain would put 1 million gallons of water very quickly into a sewer system. And I'm curious as to which agency or organization would deal with that if there are adverse effects downstream from that type of a quick. And I realize it would make a lot of difference how quick that rainfall came, but that's an extremely large amount of water
Just happen to have all the experts in the room this morning. Which one of you would like to handle that?
This is Leo Henning, and that would be part of the Clean Water Act for stormwater discharges. So KDHE would be the lead on that.
Thank you very much.
Further comments, questions? Come on, folks. We have today and tomorrow to go over all this. Representative Newland.
I don't know who wants to try to answer this and all, but I've got to go back to the dredging at Tuttle Creek, myself. Because when we start doing that dredging, we're talking about a facility that's on the northern edge of our state, and everybody knows what you push out uphill goes downhill. And so the sediments that are forced out of Tuttle Creek are going to settle somewheres. And so what would be the plan to help mitigate that at some point in time?
Turn on the microphone, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you for the question. I'm Kara Hendricks with the Water Office. So one of the things we've been working on for that project that you mentioned, which we're calling the Water Injection Dredging Demonstration Project, which would essentially demonstrate a technology called WID, Water Injection Dredging, that would push sediment out the outlet and downstream, as you mentioned. And one of the things we've done and we continue to do is look at the type of sediment that's in there, we've tested the sediment, and then also try to model with experts from the Corps and their Engineering Research Development Center to determine how that might act and how far downstream it would go. And so without really demonstrating it, it's hard to tell exactly where it's going to settle, how far downstream it'll go. But we've engaged with those stakeholders that are downstream, and part of that project would include I would say a impressive amount of monitoring during that demonstration to really see what that does downstream. So without actually doing it, we don't know what those impacts are yet or how that will, impact those folks, but that's part of that's a big part of that project, is monitoring that and determining what those impacts are before it's a full-fledged operation. Does that answer your question?
It does somewhat. Working with the conservation districts, we have different models, that we use, that we teach students with. And so I didn't know if there was some type of a model that we would be able to see, that exact type of dredging and all, to see what the effects downstream would be. So I'd be interested in that at some point in time.
Okay, certainly, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
That type of injection and stirring it up, it's been used in Europe, but not in the U.S. yet. There's tests going on. Ours will be one of the first pilot study. The hope is it'll be light enough that it'll carry all the way to the Mississippi. We'll see. So we don't know, and so we'll find out. When do you expect that project to start?
A lot of that depends on funding, as most of the projects we do do. So depending on the funding, there is funding right now in the appropriations bill that's still under consideration for that project. And then the idea, the Water Office has been working with the Corps of Engineers. That's a very strong partner in doing what we've done to date, which is a lot of that background work to make sure that sediment actually in Tuttle Creek Lake, we've sent that down to their lab. They've determined it's wittable. So all of that background work, we're working with the Corps to, leverage funding from them to do that project.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick follow-up then. With the additional funding that I hope moves on through for the study, how soon do you think the study might be done to where we might see the, a potential of start time then on the actual dredging.
Yeah, I think a lot of the work we've done to date is it shows that we're ready to demonstrate it. It's a matter of, at this point, we're looking at the biggest cost really for the state is equipment, and trying to figure out how to, we're working with other manufacturers to try to determine whether that's equipment that's already available that we could borrow or rent or lease, or if it's something that has to be built at a smaller scale to demonstrate it before, to determine the effectiveness before we invest in, before there's an investment in full scale.
All right.
Is that helpful? Sure.
Thank you for that. Representative Stogsdill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple summers ago, I went out and attended the Meet in the Middle conference out in Lindsborg. And we had a fascinating presentation from a demographer from Kansas State about population shifts. And he pointed out that after this next census comes out, that Kansas will officially be classified as an urban state. And I'm just wondering if there's, as far as water issues and so on goes, we all obviously understand the critical need for water resources for our agricultural industry and so on. But I'm wondering if there's been any talk about more study and more look at our urban areas and what the water needs are going to be for those areas, and in areas like runoff and that sort of thing.
Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earl Lewis, I'm with the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and previously with the Water Office, so got a little bit of a cross issue here. But so I would say that the state has done a good job of looking at both urban and rural issues over the years. And so certainly when we think about agricultural issues, we think about groundwater declines, we think about nutrient management and a lot of soil issues and those type of things to try and maintain our ag economy, especially in the West. In the East, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, I think we've put more emphasis on trying to make sure that we are correctly projecting the water needs for our urban and suburban areas going into the future. And then looking at, and obviously most of the places we have, our larger urban areas are more surface water driven. Certainly the Wichita area is both surface and groundwater. But looking at our reservoir system, we were just talking about Tuttle Creek, our reservoir system, making sure that they have adequate storage and that we have adequate flow going into the future. Obviously, Leo just talked about KDHE's role in stormwater runoff, and that's a big player going forward. The other thing I think there is that through the Department of Agriculture, we have the National Flood Insurance Program and floodplain mapping, and certainly as we see more urbanization and more people moving to those areas, we see the impacts of that flooding that Dr. Keene just talked about take place. We want to make sure that we have accurate maps so that if folks are being affected by flooding or potentially be affected by flooding, that they have that information, have that insurance. So we are continually looking forward for those areas that maybe haven't been what we'd say is our high priority or hot spots in the past. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I had one quick follow-up, maybe a suggestion or something, because I know we've had a pretty extensive, concentrated look at issues at the federal level, the state level, the county level, and I felt like today was really the first presentation that kind of focused on the cities and so on. And if there's any information that could be provided to us over the interim or something along that line about the cities and the water problems that they're going to be faced, or the water challenges, that sort of thing, I think it would be very helpful, especially with the obvious shift in population here in Kansas.
I've written that down. Thank you for that suggestion.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chairman,
Representative Jennings.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
Leo, did you want to say something?
if you don't mind, I was just going to add to this conversation that one of the things that cities are dealing with are the aging infrastructure of their wastewater treatment plant and drinking water systems. Many of those pipes have been in the ground for a long time now, 100 years, and they are leaking, and the replacement costs on that infrastructure is going to be a lot. So cities that are trying to deal with this issue are currently dealing with it as they can, but the cost to do this is going to be, overwhelming for them. So it's just something I wanted to bring up to the committee.
Just a bundle of good news this morning. Representative Jennings.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. While this may be the first occasion of me being in the committee personally, I have been on the other side of that wall listening intently. And there's a few things that I guess I take away from the conversations this year that I hope that we can think about, not just within this committee, but as a legislative body. We heard a lot about state water plan. And in connection with that state water plan, we also heard about how we don't fund it. We don't fund conservation districts. We don't fund $25,000 a year fully for conservation districts, for crying out loud. That's just absurd. We make promise after promise after promise to local units of government to do certain things and provide certain funding, and we fail to do it, and we failed to do it in this area as well. And that to me is just, it's just not right. During the Brownback years as governor, one of the, what I would argue is probably one of the most significant things that the governor did was brought about a conversation about a long-term plan for water in this state. He brought people together. 50-year water plan was discussed and developed among all the stakeholders, users, and all the agency people, and you name it. And it came about at a point in time that we had kind of a drought condition going on, so people were worried about it. Water and drought are funny. You talk about water during a drought, maybe a little bit when it floods, but when things are kind of normal, it's not a part of the conversation. And consequently, we become purely reactive. There is no long-term view of what we do, and we don't sustain that long-term view once it's been created because the pressure of the drought has gone away. I think one of the things that ought to happen is we ought to revisit that water plan. You know, any long-term plan, you would schedule a periodic review to see what's been done, what's not been done. Does it need to be tweaked and updated because of changing conditions? Otherwise, all the work that went into this, it'll sit on a shelf, and I don't think that's a good thing. And then, you know, the last thing I would say is you all know where I live. I live on top of a hotbed of uranium, wet uranium, albeit. We have lots and lots of irrigation, lots of sprinkler irrigation, lots of technology has been developed to help make that more efficient. But the one thing we can never change is the makeup, the composition of the soil in a significant way. And a lot of the soil where that irrigation is used that's in the Ark Valley area is very sandy, and it takes a lot of water to grow crops, and that ground will become virtually valueless if there's not water there to irrigate it, and we're getting there. And it's going to be a big hit for production. It's going to be a big hit for land values. I just think we need to refocus on that water plan. I think that's the first step, is get back to that. Let's see what's going on there, and maybe it's reconvening those folks. Maybe they do. I don't know, but I think that can be a guidepost going forward, and as a part of this, we need to be having a real serious conversation about what's going on over on the west side border of Kansas, on the west side of that border in Colorado. Water diversion, concentration of the bad things is going to become a bigger issue as time goes on. And the folks that have the responsibility and the compact to negotiate and visit with Colorado, in my view, need to become a little bit stronger in their position about quality. It's not enough to have lots of bad water. We need some quality. There needs to be some things done to mitigate. We have damages downstream that are able to be demonstrated in the town I live in, putting in $6 million reverse, it's nanofiltration system to have water that we can drink in our faucets at home. And it's as a direct consequence of uranium contamination, and that's only going to get worse, and it's only going to get broader, and people can't drink that stuff. So we're going to have big water projects in places like Garden City in the out years, I think, without a doubt. That source is going to become more contaminated and will require it. And there's two places of growth in Kansas right now. It's Finney, Kansas, and it's Johnson County, Kansas. And you're not going to continue to have growth and sustainability if you don't have drinking water available for the population, and that it doesn't price you out of work. So just a few observations and thoughts. There's plenty of work to be done, but I think the first thing is we've got to fund the water plan, for crying out loud. You can't get stuff done for free, and that just needs to happen.
Thank you for that. You did cover a lot of material there. The first thing, funding the water plant, I agree with that wholeheartedly. Now, that's part of this committee's charge, is to carry that message forward next year, whether it's within a bill, within appropriations, whatever it takes. But this committee will have to be involved in that. It's not going to happen unless we push it. So that's part of our charge to do that. The other part, I agree with the 50-year plan, and we'll ask Connie where we stand on that. Is the mic on, please?
There we are. Thank you for speaking out so powerfully about the need for funding. And indeed, the vision has been a lodestar document that has been very helpful. And the Water Office and the Water Authority are currently in the process of a form of update of that, because we're incorporating that into our update of the State Water Plan. So we're doing what you recommend, and we're in the process of taking all of our feedback from our local regional advisory committees and the Water Authority members and the state agencies. So we're working toward that very goal. And I'm going to punt the uranium question. I think Leo is probably ready to answer that. I hope that was helpful.
Leo?
Yeah, this is Leo Henning with the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. And yes, I agree with Representative Jennings' thoughts on uranium in the long run being more and more of a problem for that area. I know that the Kansas Geological Survey is close to finishing up their study on it. Once that is complete, I think that we could have a very good document to share. So I totally agree with you, Representative Jennings. Speaking of the 50-year water plan, one thing that this committee should understand was that was a water quantity document. Water quality was pretty much left out of the entire plan. And the purpose was, it was to address the declining water in Western Kansas. That was kind of the main focus for that document. I think if we do revise the 50-year plan, that water quality should be included. And I know that the Water Office supports that thought also, but it will take, another initiative to update that with water quality issues as well as water quantity issues.
Thank you for that. And the last part of his discussion concerned the compact with Colorado. Who in our state is our representative in that compact?
So on the Ark River Compact with Colorado, there's actually 3 compact commissioners. I serve as one based on my position. There are 2 local commissioners, Randy Hazlett and Troy Demler, who are both local folks there in the Lake and Garden City area, and have a lot of history. Certainly Randy has a lot of history. He's been on the compact for a number of years. And so that has been, and certainly I appreciate, I agree with Representative Jennings on many of these issues. Actually, on the vast majority here on the significance of the issue and that it's going to cause us problems down the road. I think where we need to spend some additional time, first within our own state and then addressing with Colorado, is how do we be successful, right? I think to me, there's two pieces to this. One, we want to slow down the uranium that's coming across the line from Colorado, lessen the amount we get, right? Because the real issue, part of the real issue, is that once it comes into Colorado, water really doesn't flow in the Ark River past Garden City very often. And so whatever comes in, we use the water, and whatever's in the water remains. And so that's where we get our sulfates and uranium and those kind of things that accumulate over time because we've evaporated the water off or transpired it and keep the rest of it. And so the first thing is to lessen the amount that comes across the line. And then the second is how do we make sure that our population is safe, as Representative Jennings just mentioned, not only the folks in Lincoln and Garden City, but also our domestic users. We've certainly, through Leo's folks and efforts with KDHE, have a year ago tried to, or a little more than a year ago now, offered free testing for domestic wells so those folks would at least know what the situation is. But in Kansas, it's really, if you have a domestic well, there's not a regulation. It's up to you. We can help you know what's in your water, but then you're at your own risk of whatever risk you want to take. And again, I'm not suggesting we want to change that because that has implications for tens of thousands of folks across the state. But certainly, I think we want to make sure that we are providing resources to those folks that are challenged with these issues and maybe don't have the resources. So I think it's kind of a two-part issue. And again, I think my overall effort here is I think we want to be successful in both parts there. And what's the best way to address that, both internally and with our sister state.
How often do you meet with Colorado?
Well, officially, there's an annual meeting of the compact, but we have conversations with our counterparts in Colorado pretty regularly. And so this is one of the issues that we have on our agenda. So the annual meeting of the Ark River Compact with Colorado is in December. And between now and then, we're going to try and meet fairly regularly to try and address a number of issues, this being one of them.
So, thank you for that. Yep. Appreciate that. Representative Stogsdill.
Yes, I was just curious, when they were talking earlier today about the stormwater systems and so on in our urban areas and how they are really becoming quite old. I know that in Johnson County there, the systems have lasted longer than the maps. They're not even sure where some of the pipes and so on are in some of our cities. And I just can't imagine how the state is going to have the finances to address replacing some of these systems. That is going to be incredibly expensive. And I'm just wondering if there is any kind of monitoring or anything at the state level about our access to federal grants or other grants and so on like that that could help us with some of these water issues, or it looks like something that that ought to be reviewed every couple of years too, to make sure that we're getting every bit of help we can from federal sources or any other sources that can help with our water problems.
Would anyone care to speak on that?
Sure, this is Leo Henning again.
Okay.
We do have the state revolving loan fund that provides low interest loans to municipalities so that they can upgrade their piping and facilities. I would just also add that it looks like, or it appears like, that EPA and the new administration, that infrastructure, especially water infrastructure, is very high on their list of things to accomplish. So there may be even additional money coming out of EPA to provide grants, loan forgiveness, and additional money for the revolving loan funds to help the cities make these investments in their infrastructure. So I hope that in the future there more money is available, but right now we have the ability to loan money at about a 1% interest to the communities to do this type of work. But it is up to the communities. It's not, the state can provide the funding, but it's up to each community to upgrade their system.
Thank you for that. Any more questions in the room or out in the virtual world? I see none outside. Inside. Representative Orr first, and then Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the comments from Representative Jennings. I think one of the problems we are facing is that we continue to look at a 50-year water plan, and that takes away all the sense of urgency. And I would like this committee to start looking in a shorter term of a 5 or 10-year water plan to help that sense of urgency that we haven't ever had, that I think we really do need. And so that's one of the changes I'd like to see, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just, while we're discussing loans, have the discussion out there of looking at the replacing and promoting some of the infrastructure that some of the rural water districts have of, we have some very small, very old, 50 years and older rural water districts, water network districts, and seems like they are not going to take that challenge on unless they are promoted and aided with some kind of loans, low interest loans in order to offset some of those infrastructures. I mean, some of them, they were built, like I say, 50 years ago or longer, 60 years ago. The piping and everything is very, very old, small. And so we need to help them, promote them to upgrade their systems and infrastructure. Thank you.
Further comments, questions? Representative Jennings.
Just one quick in response to what Representative Orr had to say. I guess it's a matter of vision of how you would see a plan, if you will. And I like to see a plan as a project that you start with the end in mind. So you set your vision, your goal of where you would like to be, and you begin to develop that, working backwards basically, because you can't get where you don't know you want to get, and you work projects backward typically in terms of a timeline. And then that should articulate clearly duties and responsibilities that are measurable over time, that there's a systematic review over time, that there's a communication system built within that. We're talking about a plan that crosses multiple agencies, and especially if the plan that would be perhaps reviewed and updated went to the water quality, that's going to bring in, another track, if you will, within it to be included. But I guess in the end, it's about the sophistication of the plan as a project document and project approach, as opposed to just, well, here's what we'd like to do, and these are the components. You bring a little bit more formality to it and say, yeah, here's what we want to do. Here's who's going to do it. Here's the timeline we'd like to see it get done in. And then there's an accountability piece among the group who have that responsibility, and perhaps legislature and governors over time. I think the way that this sustains itself as a state priority is through that active ongoing process and really strong communication among those involved. And then the accountability piece of what was supposed to be done, when did it get done, if it didn't get done, why not, and how do we rearrange that, adjust for conditions. And then it has to be nimble enough to adjust to changes in circumstance that bring pressure that maybe had not been contemplated to begin with. So, I mean, these guys are nodding their heads up and down. They know about project management, and maybe a lot of this is going on. But you're right. If you don't set some short-term and intermediate-term goals to be achieved and then hold to account in achieving those, 50 years is way too long.
What Representative Jennings is recommending is a Gantt chart. So we want an end goal, and then we want to back that up. We want the Gantt chart to show what projects are going to happen, the time limit, and the reporting structure. So I think that's a great thing that he will work on. Any further comments?
Chairman Hyman, this is Leo Henning.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to reply to Representative Riley's comment about aging infrastructure. One of the things that KDHE is pushing with EPA at the national level is the fact that many of our smaller communities that are economically challenged could not even take a loan because they couldn't pay it back. And that would also include for the small rural water districts. So we are really pressing that in the future, if we could get some grant money for these communities that cannot, I mean, economically, they cannot make the investments. That is something that we are really pushing at the national level.
Thank you. That makes great sense. Representative Murphy.
Yeah, just had a comment. I think all this is great, what we've got going on here. I made notes yesterday that they talked about the 50-year plan. Actually, they called it a vision, and they said they have a 5-year plan that actually they work on. So, I mean, we're not just, I don't think they're just shooting from the hip. They do have something kind of like that going on, I think. So.
And I think we may see some of that 5-year plan in our August meeting, if that's correct. Okay. Please come right up and speak to us.
If I could add to this conversation just a little bit. I had the opportunity to be on Governor Brownback's vision team, and you're exactly right. It was I've been around this game for longer than I'd like to admit. Coming up on 30 years now. It was the most energy I'd seen related to water in that entire time. Partially because it was focused. But partially because there was political will to take the issue on. It came from the governor's office, and he put his own attention and time, showed up at events, and raised the profile of the issue. And I think all of you recognize that unless there's a crisis, unless the state is coming in and proposing significant regulations on folks, or unless there's a large funding initiative, most things, or there's political will put to it by somebody in particular, it's hard to get folks' attention on what's happening in government. And that's just the way that it is. And so on one hand, I want to certainly applaud you for getting this committee together and having this discussion. We will need your support in the long term to maintain that political attention on water. We've certainly heard, and again, I agree, we need to fully fund the water plan. But what we had put together, part of the issue with the long-term vision and even the water plan is we put these things together, everybody agrees, says, yeah, we need to do those things. They take more money than we have, and then we don't come back to them for 5 years, and then 5 years later we say, why don't we get them done? I think there needs to be a regular reporting mechanism discussion back with the legislature so that you all who have the political will to try and move things forward or not, depending on what you think is important, can actually help us move those things forward. Because we can certainly put plans together, and if we have the resources, we can certainly execute them because we, as you say, we have a number of folks that are very skilled at project management and bringing things to fruition. But it's that gap of are we actually going to take this issue on? Are we actually going to fund those things that need to be funded? Is where oftentimes things fall by the wayside. And so I just wanted to throw that in as well, because I do think that we've got a better long-term vision. We absolutely need to get the water quality wrapped in and make sure we have a long-term idea of what we want our water quality to be. We've got a good idea of what we ought to be doing in the next 1, 2, 5 years. We can tell you what that is, but it may cost $50 million, and if we've got 3, then we're going to be way short. So, thank you.
Representative Newland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a brief comment. I sit on the Natural Resources Budget Committee, second year now, and we get the review of the budgets for these different groups, but we get it for 2 days. And it's a very, very short time to review these very in-depth budgets and try to determine what we can or cannot do with it. And I think that's the thing that we can do in this committee here, is to help take time to review that so that when those budgets go to the budget committee, something can be done then.
Good point. We'll prepare you. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to continue this side conversation on the rural fire districts, and just doing a comparison, I agree with the concept of grants rather than loans. That helps out a lot. But the side note to that, in my experience, looking at like the small city of Caldwell, South Haven, down in my district, some of those folks can afford to hire somebody to write a grant. And that's what the name of the game is anymore, is who can you find to write a grant for things. But I just want everyone to kind of look back and, you know, the people that are in those rural fire district or rural water districts are farmers, sometimes ranchers, but, you know, they are urban people, and they're not going to take the time or have the knowledge or know the system in order to find a grant writer, write a grant, figure out how to write a grant, those kind of things. So somebody's going to have to step out for them, reach out to them, and if we're going to do some grant kind of things. These folks are not the folks that are going to do that grant writing stuff. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Jennings. For our last comment, I have to go testify.
Yeah, I love what Representative Newland had to say, because it is a statement as to that entire appropriation process. So this is like the water committee, so it's going to be water appropriations. You have maybe 2 hours of time to look at the detail of any particular agency budget, and it doesn't matter if it's the water office or the DCF. The structure of the appropriation process now does not provide legislators sufficient time, nor does it provide sufficient detail. And it seems to me that structurally that could be changed, that you could have appropriations meeting basically 2 sessions a day, 5 days a week or 4 days a week, and those subcommittees meeting daily around their budget target areas, to where you could have a much more in-depth conversation and discussion about what goes on. So people involved in appropriations would do nothing but work involved with appropriations, where you could get to a level of detail and understanding of the complexities of this budget. You know, I had a chance in my career to develop an agency budget, and I know what goes on the front end, and I know the level of detail that goes on in the front end, but you never see it. You never see a bit of that detail, and I think in that way, agencies probably like you don't, are happy you don't. I mean, I do see that. Micromanagement through funding is not a great experience to have as an agency person, but we do not have that level of detail of knowledge and understanding, and vote on $14 billion state budget with precious little information in it. I think the structure of process could be adjusted to provide an opportunity for greater insight and understanding around water budgets.
At least he tied it back to the committee. I want to thank the committee for your work. And tomorrow we'll meet one more time and remind you to bring your calendars so we can figure out a date in August to meet. I'm pretty sure we'll get approved for our one full day of intermeeting. And tomorrow, I want you to think about organization. We've talked some about budgeting today. The whole shooting match. We want to cover all those topics tomorrow so that you'll have something to go home and study. You'll have homework this summer. And then in August, we'll sit down and we'll try to put the pieces together that you've all come up with. So, and want to thank our special guests for hanging around, answering questions. We appreciate it very much. Leo, good to see you again.
Thank you. I had to take myself off of mute. I'm glad to be here. If anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.